You already know this if you're a John Carpenter fan or have watched John Carpenter movies for long enough. Whenever his horror endings come up, a lot of people like to point to the same word, ambiguous. I've even used that word before, and it's not wrong, but that's where the conversation usually stops. Ambiguity gets treated like just a vibe or a shrug, or just like Carpenter refusing to give answers. And when that happens, something very intentional starts to feel more vague instead of precise. Because Carpenter absolutely denies narrative comfort at the end of his films. Evil doesn't die cleanly. Good doesn't always win, and you don't get the explanation you want. But the most important part is why he does this. And that why changes from film to film. So this isn't a ranking or whether one film is good and another film is bad. What I want to talk about is how Carpenter uses ambiguity as a stylistic tool, and how that tool is doing very different work depending on the movie. I am Brandy, otherwise known as the Terrific Lady, and welcome back to Retro Horror School, where we discuss, dissect, and analyze horror from the 1970s through the 2010s. Class is in session. Before I get into the films I'm going to be talking about in this video, I want to clarify something. I'm not saying that John Carpenter's other horror films don't have ambiguous endings. They absolutely do. If you look at some of his other horror movies like Christine, Village of the Damned, Ghosts of Mars, or Vampires, ambiguity is still there. There's uncertainty. There's unresolved tension. Sometimes there's that lingering sense of unease that hits after the credits roll. What's different, and here's a key distinction, is what that ambiguity is doing. In many of those films, ambiguity enforces mood, tone, or continuation. It keeps the world opening, the threat lingering, or the emotional state unresolved. In the films I'm focusing on here, ambiguity is doing structural and thematic labor. It's ambiguity that actively destabilizes how the characters and the audience understand reality, knowledge, and control. And this is why this is not a full breakdown of all of his endings. It's a focused look at the endings where ambiguity is the mechanism. So when I talk about ambiguity in these endings, I'm talking about denial. Specifically the denial of mastery, the idea that if we have just enough information, we can understand what's happening, we can contain it, we can stop it. Across these endings, John Carpenter uses ambiguity in two different ways. In some films, the horror comes from misreading reality, using the wrong framework to interpret the world. In other films, in others, reality is clear and it still doesn't help. The first function applies to the Apocalypse trilogy. Ha! You thought you were going to skip the Apocalypse trilogy. Well, you're not. In these films, the characters misunderstand the kind of reality that they're coming up against in the first place. The horror comes from interpretation failing. In The Thing, everything depends on trust. Identity is assumed to be stable. People are trusted to be who they say they are. Evidence is supposed to provide certainty. Trust equals safety. And the ending destroys that entire framework. People still debate who's who at the end. But the real horror is that knowing becomes impossible. Survival doesn't mean safety. Trust doesn't mean certainty. They're alive, yes, but they are still doomed. The film denies the answers to the characters and to us. In Prince of Darkness, misreading happens through the misreading of faith and institutions, and also of time and interpretation. Reality is assumed to be linear. Cause precedes effect. Science tries to explain what's happening. Academia tries to categorize it. Religion, the institution that should have the answers, fails completely. And the dream transmissions that pop up don't clarify anything. They arrive without any kind of explanation. Once they finally understand it, it's a little too late to act on it. And is it even possible at the end to go into that mirror dimension? To save the person that sacrificed herself, stop the end of the world. In The Mouth of Madness, this idea goes all the way. Fiction is assumed to reflect reality, not govern it. That gets flipped on its head. Sanity is assumed to exist independently of the story, and that gets flipped on its head too. And by the end, awareness gives you nothing. You don't even know if you're sane. Across all three films, the endings are ambiguous because the rules that the characters were using to interpret reality were wrong from the start. That's not what's happening in Halloween or They Live. Those endings are doing something else entirely. Halloween never asks us to understand Michael Myers. The characters don't even understand him. Loomis just puts it out there that he is purely and simply evil, case closed, and that's all you need to know. The film refuses interpretation by design. Michael is the shape. He isn't some kind of puzzle to solve. He's proof that evil doesn't need motive, psychology, or explanation. When the body of Michael Myers disappears at the end, closure disappears with it. The ending is ambiguous because evil was never meant to be understood. They Live flips the question completely. By the end, reality is entirely visible. The signal's destroyed. Everybody knows the truth, and it doesn't really fix anything. Exposure doesn't immediately dismantle power. Awareness arrives after irreversible damage to systems, the class structures, to people. That ending is ambiguous, not because the truth is hidden, but because that knowledge doesn't immediately equal change. Carpenter is testing different limits of human control. Some endings ask, what if we were wrong about reality? Other endings ask, what if we were right? And it still doesn't help. Either way, mastery is denied. Denied. That denial, not necessarily lack of answers, but that denial is the final horror. We, as humans, always have to know why. That's our curse. We always have to know why. John Carpenter removes the answer to that question and leaves us sitting with the consequences. That's why these endings linger, that's why they're still argued about, and that's why they still work. One more video in the John Carpenter retrospective course, and that's it for John Carpenter, not for Retro Horror School. But the next director I will do a retrospective on and deep dive into is another one that has changed the horror genre, and I can't wait to get started on that one. But until then, if you want to go deeper into the misreading reality side of Carpenter, I suggest that you check out my video, How We Misread the Apocalypse Trilogy Next. I'll be sure to pop up the link to that. And if you're the kind of horror fan that likes analysis beyond is it good or is it bad, then you know what to do. Class is dismissed, everybody, for now. But I'll see you next time. Bye!